1926.962, Grounding for the Protection of Employees, Subpart V. 1926.962, A. Application. This section applies to grounding of transmission and distribution lines and equipment for the purpose of protecting employees. Paragraph D of this section also applies to protective grounding of other equipment as required elsewhere in this subpart. Note to paragraph A. This section covers grounding of transmission and distribution lines and equipment when this subpart requires protective grounding and whenever the employer chooses to ground such lines and equipment for the protection of employees. 1926.962 B. General. For any employee to work transmission and distribution lines or equipment as de-energized, the employer shall ensure that the lines or equipment are de-energized under the provisions of Section 1926.961 and shall ensure proper grounding of the lines or equipment as specified in paragraphs C through H of this section. However, if the employer can demonstrate that installation of a ground is impracticable or that the conditions resulting from the installation of a ground would present greater hazards to employees than working without grounds, the lines and equipment may be treated as de-energized provided that the employer establishes that all of the following conditions apply. 1926.962 B1 through 1926.962 B3, de-energized. The employer ensures that the lines and equipment are de-energized under the provisions of Section 1926.961. No possibility of contact. There is no possibility of contact with another energized source. No induced voltage. The hazard of induced voltage is not present. 1926.962 C. Equipotential zone. Temporary protective grounds shall be placed at such locations and arranged in such a manner that the employer can demonstrate will prevent each employee from being exposed to hazardous differences in electric potential. Note to paragraph C. Appendix C to this subpart contains guidelines for establishing the equipotential zone required by this paragraph. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration will deem grounding practices meeting these guidelines as complying with paragraph C of this section. 1926.962 D. Protective grounding equipment. 1926.962 D1. Ampacity. 1926.962 D1 I through 1926.962 D1 2. Protective grounding equipment shall be capable of conducting the maximum fault current that could flow at the point of grounding for the time necessary to clear the fault. Protective grounding equipment shall have an ampacity greater than or equal to that of No. 2 AWG copper. 1926.962 D2. Impedance. Protective grounds shall have an impedance low enough so that they do not delay the operation of protective devices in case of accidental energizing of the lines or equipment. Note to paragraph D. American Society for Testing and Materials Standard Specifications for Temporary Protective Grounds to be used on de-energized electric power lines and equipment, ASTM F855-09, contains guidelines for protective grounding equipment. The Institute of Electrical Engineers Guide for Protective Grounding of Power Lines, IEEE STD 1048-2003, contains guidelines for selecting and installing protective grounding equipment. 1926.962 E. Testing. The employer shall ensure that, unless a previously installed ground is present, employees test lines and equipment and verify the absence of nominal voltage before employees install any ground on those lines or that equipment. 1926.962 F. Connecting and removing grounds. 1926.962 F1. Order of connection. The employer shall ensure that, when an employee attaches a ground to a line or to equipment, the employee attaches the ground end connection first and then attaches the other end by means of a live line tool. For lines or equipment operating at 600 volts or less, the employer may permit the employee to use insulating equipment other than a live line tool if the employer ensures that the line or equipment is not energized at the time the ground is connected, or if the employer can demonstrate that each employee is protected from hazards that may develop if the line or equipment is energized. 1926.962 F2. Order of removal. The employer shall ensure that, when an employee removes a ground, The employee removes the grounding device from the line or equipment using a liveline tool before he or she removes the ground end connection. For lines or equipment operating at 600 volts or less, the employer may permit the employee to use insulating equipment other than a liveline tool if the employer ensures that the line or equipment is not energized at the time the ground is disconnected, or if the employer can demonstrate that each employee is protected from hazards that may develop if the line or equipment is energized. 1926.962 G. Additional precautions. The employer shall ensure that, when an employee performs work on a cable at a location remote from the cable terminal, the cable is not grounded at the cable terminal if there is a possibility of hazardous transfer of potential should a fault occur. 1926.962 H. Removal of grounds for test. The employer may permit employees to remove grounds temporarily during tests. During the test procedure, the employer shall ensure that each employee uses insulating equipment, shall isolate each employee from any hazards involved, and shall implement any additional measures necessary to protect each exposed employee in case the previously grounded lines and equipment become energized.